Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm Tony Joy from Sound Particles. This is going to be an amazing webinar coming live from LA. And joining me today is a really exciting, amazing panel. I will start with Scott Martin Gershin, sound designer extraordinaire. He's also joining me from LA. Thank you so much, Scott, for joining us. It's midnight here, so Scott is doing us a huge favor for joining us. So Scott, welcome.
My pleasure.
He is the brains and ears behind many movies that most of you have already seen, including Pinocchio, Transformers 1, multiple video games, sound designer extraordinaire. Very happy to have you, Scott. Also joining us is Emre from London. Early morning to you, my friend. Thank you so much for joining us bright and early. Uh, Emre is also a legendary mixer, engineer, producer. He's worked with artists like Brian Eno, Sia, Lily Allen, much more. He's a visionary and he's been one of the pioneers when it comes to spatial music production and mixing. So we have an amazing sound designer and an amazing mixer producer joining us. Emre has also worked on many soundtracks and much more music content. We also have Marco joining us from ESMAE. He's a researcher, he's an artist, he is leading education, and so is Chris McAlpine, who will be back on camera in a minute from SAE in Australia. So Marco, welcome.
Thank you very much. Welcome. Good morning, good evening, good night to everybody.
Yeah. We have all the time zones. This is a global webinar, right? And last but not the least, joining us is our founder and CEO of Sound Particles, Nuno Fonseca, coming live from Portugal, from our headquarters in Liria in Portugal. Welcome, Nuno.
Hi, everyone. Good to be here.
Cool. Awesome. So today's agenda is more about one sound design and immersive music workflows, and more especially about how students and educators can get involved. There's lots of buzzwords and spatial and this and that going around. How do one people understand what spatial audio is all about? And then how does artists like Scott and Amre, how do you guys use these tools, right? And then how does people like Chris and Ricardo and Nuno, right? Nuno being an educator himself, former educator, how do we bring all these together? So Scott, if you don't mind, I will start with you, the first question. So you design sound, you live and breathe sounds. When you design sounds, what are the unique challenges? Or how do you start the process when you work on a movie like Pinocchio or Transformers 1?
Sure. So, for me, it's a little bit like music in the fact that my job is to tell a story. We've got a script, we've got actors, we've got picture editors that are setting the pace of how the show is going to be cut. But even if you look back at the script, you need to understand how the story is going to be phrased, both in scene by scene and full story arcs. And then you try to figure out, okay, how are we going to enhance those scenes? Do we add a lot of sound? I also start working with the composer and understanding how they're thinking of it. As we get together, we put together a formula of the first cut.
Right.
We then start taking that, but I start at the script actually early on to understand, if there's a big battle, do I actually want to hear the battle, or maybe I want to go silent with sound effects and let music go, or maybe no music and just hardcore realism in any given scene. So you start playing around with the ideas, you see them shoot the film, you start seeing, oh, it's stylized. It's going to be black and white, or they're going to shoot it in a certain way that now I'm thinking, oh, if the visual has a lot of style and the way it's being cut, well, then I can use audio in a much more stylistic way rather than realistic or surreal.
Right.
And then a lot of times when we see it, like when I did a movie called American Beauty, and when I saw the script, the director, Sam, was very, well, it's not a big sound effects movie. And I said, no, this is minimalistic. So I read the whole script and described what I was hearing in my head about using negative space. And then
Nice.
I'm a huge Tom Newman fan. And then we all met in New York and we started seeing it. We're like, oh, look at how he shot it and look how it's being cut. Now all of a sudden, instead of me coming with ideas that I want to try out, I let the film talk to me first, see what the story's about, and then figure out what sonic paintbrushes I want to use to better tell the story.
That is fascinating. So, you mentioned that you would work with the director at the script level, right? Before things even get started. And you also mentioned keeping the composer in mind. Do you interface with composers at that point, or at what point do you start working with the music team?
Usually once there's a cut that's available, a lot of times I ask to meet with the composer. So here's a good one. I did a movie years ago called Live, and James Newton Howard's doing the music. So it's this giant plane crash in the Andes, and the Andes. And anyway, so it's basically the soccer team
Uh-huh.
situation survival. So we wanted the plane to be so loud and so realistically uncomfortable, basically, because we needed to create sound deprivation. You can't
Right.
create sound deprivation unless you have a lot of sound. And now the contrast comes out. So the plane goes, hits, boom, snow, then dead silence, and all you hear is one creaking piece of metal. Out of that is an acoustic guitar that James does. He starts doing this. So I said, wait a second, what key is the guitar in? And I said, oh, I tuned the wind into the same key as the guitar. So now it
Mm.
sounds like the guitar comes out of the wind. It wasn't an accident, it was strategic, but it helped tell the story and give you that emotional feel.
Absolutely. That's amazing and inspiring. And Emre, I know you worked on soundtracks in addition to pop records and such, right? So do you also keep sound design in mind when you're mixing the scores? How do you approach that from a music mixer perspective?
That's often inherent in the arrangements. And often when I've got these scores to mix, they are so nearly complete when they arrive because they've gone through iteration after iteration after iteration with the whole team. So I'm kind of finalizing the mix often. Sometimes it's really creative depending who I'm working with. But uh, something like, I guess that we did a film called Logan Lucky recently where we were going to do the whole score as a band. But in the end, they ended up licensing almost all the temp music because it was all really old, very rare funk and soul records, and they were super easy to license. So they ended up loving the temp and keeping it. But that was a challenging one in that we had to match the music to these to be seamless. There's a few scenes they just wanted to score, so we had to recreate that kind of thing. But in terms of sound design, at my point, I get minimal input at that point in the mixing phase because what I'm really delivering, really honestly, in movie scores is stems most of the time. And the re-recording mixer probably has the most interface. I don't know
Right.
if other people find this, but I'm sort of ending up pleasing the composer ultimately and realizing their vision because they're then often worried about the next process and maintaining that through. So I try and give them like, so there is a bit of a tussle sometimes, but it doesn't become with sound design too much. It's more in the degree of separation that they're happy giving stem wise. So, but that's the only real integration I get there. And often it depends on the composer as well. Sometimes these mixes are done quite early and then they kind of stay. And then the music editor might take the stems on from there and the mix doesn't change because
Right.
so they vary. And I'm sure Scott will, have much more experience of this than me, but it seems to be a quest to get the vision through, and then it ends up with the final team where everything really gets solidified. I don't know if that's always the case, but that's been my experience in what I've done.
That's really good. The reason why I was really inspired by Scott's mention of sound design and getting started at the script level and working with composers is because when you usually work in the academy, and more than likely Marco and maybe Nuno can jump in as well, usually students try to focus just on one aspect of production, right? Oh, I want to be just in music only. I don't care about sound design or editing. I agree. You need to focus and learn the craft. Sometimes they even go as far as saying, "Oh, I want to focus just on mixing, recording. I want to learn." But again, as you both will agree, also with my background working on movie scores, one thing I learned the hard way, if you will, is to be a good mixer, I need to think like a good composer. To be a good composer, you need to think like a good director, right? You have to think at least one or two levels higher. I see both of you smiling, so I'm hoping you both agree with me there.
Absolutely.
So this is very important. Marco, any thoughts on how you see the academy evolving with sound design and music?
You touched a nice spot there, because usually students they take time to go to the level where they realize that everything matters in terms of understanding the composer side, the music aspect, and the sound design, and how they can interconnect. It's challenging, because it's like you said, they're learning the craft and learning the tools, and sometimes they just focus on tweaking the knobs in Ableton or something like that, and they forget that what the most important part is emotion and feeling, and how we interconnect, like Scott was not Scott yes like Scott was saying about just the fact that he tuned the wind to the key of the guitar, kind of like you need to understand each department to get to that point, and it's challenging for academia to try and say, listen, the tool is important, but at the end, what's really important, it's the emotion you give to stuff, and the narrative is way more important than Pro Tools or Ableton or whatever. It's the tool you have at the moment that will make you special, because if you understand what makes the story special or what makes the music special, it doesn't really matter how you get there.
That's it, right?
Absolutely.
What Scott said is absolute gold at the very beginning. It's like that approach of looking globally without even thinking. I mean, there's no technical mention in anything Scott said, is because it's about the story, and that's the same with music and everything. It's an overview and understanding that permeates all the way through the process. And so tuning the wind is a specific detail, but that's only fed by your approach right to the whole picture, which is hard to do when you're learning, because you've got all the technical stuff in front of you and all the challenges you might face with that. But that's all irrelevant.
Yeah, go ahead, Scott.
I was going to say one thing that the students should know, because I always get this from people who aren't in the business yet. Okay, they think they shoot the film, they cut the film is done, they give it to me, they give it to the composer, and then we do our thing. Nope. So the film is constantly in a state of flux in two different ways. They're trying to find their cut. They're trying to figure out what to put in. Have we said with dialogue, are we repeating ourselves? Are we helping to propel the story? Are we creating pace? Are we moving through the scenes correctly? And then there's another thing. So that's the creative fun part of just really giving it a bit of phrasing and flow. And then there's when you do movies or shows that have a lot of visual effects. Okay, so when they give you visual effects, they give you 8 frames in the beginning and the end to nudge it into the scene. Okay, so I did one film where the director loved the 8 frames. He kept them all the time. So the music's done, it's recorded, we've got it, and we've got 1,000 cuts, all with 8 frame extensions in the beginning and the end. Nothing's hitting right, especially the music. Sound effects, I can go in Pro Tools and push and pull, extend, and all that. The music cut looked like barcode. Because now all of a sudden they've got to make the hits and the streaming. We got to time expand a couple scenes or a couple shots to be able to land on the hit where we want. And that's the reality. God bless music editors. They get their hands full. And I've seen, we did a Team America and there were 8 music editors.
Yeah, and I don't want to see the tempo maps on those sessions. I'll stand back, man.
It's crazy. So not only does it take time and the composer's already, he's done.
Yep.
And that goes to the music editor and the re-recording mixer to try to take the vision of what the composer did and make it still work based on significant changes to picture.
Yeah.
I feel I've got off really easy, I have to say.
But, because we were talking about spatiality, we'll bring it up later, but you also make strategic decisions because the spatial move in one scene may no longer work anymore because the scene changed.
Right. And this all goes back to, again, I +1 on what Emre said. What you said, Scott, was goal. It's about storytelling through sound or music, right? And, I had one of the composers I work with tell me I was mixing something for, I don't know how many days or whatnot. We are trying to get that final mix for the score. And he said, Tony, listen, no one is going to care if you spend 5 minutes or 5 years on that mix and you mix that on Logic or Cubase or Pro Tools. All that matters is how the emotion is delivered to whoever listens to it, right? So I want to go back to that point where you tuned the guitar sound and the sound effect, right, of the metal to match in that sound design. So I would imagine at the time you would use a pitch shifter plugin or something like that to kind of change the pitch of your sound effect, right? The reason why I bring this up is at Sound Particles, Nunos, Brain, and all the amazing developers we have, we try to make tools that make all this process easy, right? So I'm just going to, if you don't mind, give everyone a quick overview on Sound Particles 2, if that's okay, just to explain this one concept that Scott touched on. So for those of you who are new to us, we are Sound Particles. We are known for, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Perfect. So this Sound Particles 2 is our flagship software that you have heard in many movies. Professionals like Scott and many others use it. What it does is CGI for sound design, right? So this one specific example, I'm trying to create rain sounds using just 4 source files. That is one source file. Here's another. And then the second track has just 2 source files. And then I'm hitting play and you'll hear all that, right? And again, this is a very quick overview of what Sound Particles does. It's CGI for sound. You can drag and drop 10 footsteps and make 50,000 footsteps based out of it. But one thing I want to point out to Scott's point is the audio modifiers. So I can create a brand new session, right? And I can say maybe I'm creating, actually, there's a session I typically use. I did not open it up today because this was not planned, but I'm glad Scott mentioned that tuning example. So the session I'm opening up is a stadium example, which some of you might have seen or heard if you attended our previous webinars. While I wait for it to load, here we are. So this is a stadium example, right? I have 5 tracks where one is going to create whistles, one is going to create boos and cheers and whatnot. What I want to point out is we have something called audio modifiers in Sound Particles. What that would mean is for this whistles track, for example, I am asking this track to create 50 whistles and I'm giving it like 8 source files. And in the audio modifiers, I'm telling the system, hey, create random gain, random delay, random grain, so that each whistle sounds different, so it sounds realistic. The key part here I want to point out because of Scott's point is the random pitch. If you wanted to, let's say Scott is working on a new movie where there's a stadium, but it's a horror movie, something bad is going to happen. You don't want to lead the audience into it directly, but you want to kind of give that feeling like something is not right. You could go into the advanced settings in here and create a very eerie dissonant chord, musical chord using this whistle sound design. So the stadium will sound like in a minor 7th dissonant chord. So anyone who hears it will feel like, I don't know what it is, but there's something wrong, right? Imagine doing that with 50 audio tracks in Pro Tools and changing the pitch, right? So to Scott's example earlier, you had this one file that you had to align with the music, right? With tools like sound particles, you can have 500, 600, or thousands of brand new sounds that can be tuned to the music or the storytelling, which makes the whole sound design creation experience much more enjoyable and easier. Won't you agree, Scott? What do you think of tools like that in your sound design journey?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when you go to the psychology of audio. Two things that people hear all the time. Your ear always goes to the highest frequency. And the other part is because of our hunter-gathering as humans, we are very sensitive to any kind of movement.
Right.
Anytime it moves, we're going to track it. It's just we're built that way. And sometimes what I really love about using sound particles for, subtly actually, is all of a scene. Actually, I know you've got crowds, but it's crowds. And all of a sudden, if I have the crowds stagnant, it's going to create a tone which is going to get in the way of the music. It's now this long, steady, tonal kind of sound. It becomes noise. It starts masking all of the cool things that other sounds, music, and other sound effects are having in the mix. So a lot of times what I like to do is start moving it a little bit. So all of a sudden your ear, not enough to be distracting and upstage what's happening in front of you, but all of a sudden if you tickle it a little bit and it's just moving around, especially in a theater with surrounds, you hear it, but you can hear it at a very, very low volume without it becoming dominant, letting everything play in front of it. And it adds a nice contrast. So the dialogue is stagnant. A lot of the effects are stagnant. And now all of a sudden the shimmery crowd's moving a little bit, and it just opens up the theater or home theater a lot. And it just gives you a really kind of interesting experience if you're doing concert movies or crowds.
Thank you for that, Scott. Oh, go ahead, Emre.
I've used this in music to do transitions for exactly the same reason, like absolutely with pitched elements and actually with some drum parts, because it's crazy if you can throw whole tracks in sound particles and you get incredible results depending on your particle size and everything. It's pretty incredible. I've actually done exactly the same function of stopping a monotony or a drone. I've used this quite subtly, exactly the same way.
So we are the masters of movement, right? And I take pride in that. It's Nuno's brainchild, right? Adding movement to particles in sound particles. First thing I want to point out is there is a built-in Doppler in sound particles too. So if you turn it on for sound design sessions, I would have it on. So if you have a bee buzzing by, you'd hear the Doppler, right? But if I'm doing musical work, I just turn it on. It's a master setting. And since Emre mentioned the musical work, one example I have here is just one vocal track being turned into 500 particles, right? So I'm using a single vocal file from this gentleman named Nakul. This is the original voice. I throw it into sound particles and I'm about to create 500 particles and you get this. And going back to the psychology of sound, Scott, the very first webinar I did for sound particles, we spoke about the neurons that actually light up when there's movement, going back to the whole predator thing, right? Our brain thinks, hey, something is moving, check it out to make sure it's safe. That's why if you have a clock ticking, our brain ignores it because it's this non-safe sound. So by adding micro movements, you are able to bring your sound design and your music to life, like both Emre and Scott mentioned. Students, if you're listening to this, this is some of the gold advice that most people won't share live on air. So make note, and if you get a chance, don't trust any of us, but look at the automation lanes of any good movie or sound design mix. You will always see micro movements. It's almost like the mixers or the sound designers like Scott left their fingers just hovering on the faders. It's not like the fader is moving up and down all the time, but there's always these tiny movements, right, Scott?
Absolutely. I mean, when I was younger, when people would say like a dB and be like, yeah, you can't hear a dB, I can now hear quarter dBs and half a dB in regards to relationships between two sounds. By itself, not as much, but all of a sudden, you take something and bring it up or down, a lot of times down, a half a dB, and all of a sudden, it unmasks a whole bunch of other sounds, just
Yeah.
enough to get some hair on it. And that's the great shows that are great mixed. That's really what you're fighting for.
Yeah, this is constant. It's like you play half a dB ride and maybe not notice it, but against something else, it's not subtle. It's like it can be
Yeah.
quite really noticeable, and it's quite hard when you're starting out to believe that sometimes, but it's a deal.
Yeah. And one of the new things I like about spatial audio is that now you don't have to ride your volume, but you can, like Scott said, we can now move things to get the same hook in our brains, right? In fact, Nuno, why don't you jump in and tell us what your thought process was when you were creating sound particles too, with movement and even plugins like Energy Panner, which thrives, or Brightness Panner, which basically lives on movement. What was your thought process?
Well, so first of all, I always have this engineering physics kind of thought regarding things. So if I want to simulate a crowd, yes, we can think on a sound editing kind of level and just, okay, I have these tracks and you miss these tracks, and but essentially I always try to think on the natural way. Okay, it's 1,000. If I have a crowd of 10,000 people, okay, it's going to be 10,000 sounds there. And of course, some will be closer to the listener, some will be further away, and pretty much that was the idea regarding sound particles. And I love movies, and at some point I realized that the best visual effects I would see on movies use particle systems, to generate thousands of small points to do things like fire, explosions, fairy dust, desert storms, those sorts of things. And I thought, okay, wouldn't it be nice if you could do the same thing with sound and create like thousands of small sounds that together would create these fantastic soundscapes? And then, of course, to do that, I had to create this 3D CGI kind of approach. And pretty much that became my vision of having 3D workflows and thinking at a higher level, which means that, okay, if I want to do even a small thing like a car passing by, instead of thinking as a sound designer that is working at low level parameters, like what is the automation of gain and automation of pitch and automation of equalizing and those sorts of things, to be able to think at a higher level. Say, no, it's a car, it's moving like 50 miles per hour, or it's moving 80 miles per hour, and the microphone it's here, or it is further away to get a smoother kind of sound. So try to think in a different kind of approach. And for me, that's a different way of doing. And actually, what we are doing now with sound particles, it's pretty much what has been doing in animation. So with classic animation, pretty much you work on the image that should appear on the screen, and then we have CGI animation where you know, okay, if you want to have some object, okay, you model the object from any single angle, and then you use that and virtual cameras, and by that you are able to get much more interesting results, much more natural, the lighting, all of those things. So the idea here is try to bring all of that kind of vision into sound and allow professionals to use sound in a different way, because sometimes the best results it's done by this. Once again, imagine the soundscape. As a sound designer, especially students will have the idea, okay, it's a soundscape, so let's have 50 tracks on Pro Tools. But then when you start adding sounds, you probably, without noticing, you put pretty much all of those sounds almost at the same volume, which will not work very well as a soundscape, because a soundscape, you have a few sounds close to you and many sounds very far away with very low volume. So it's a different way of thinking. And of course, movement, it's part of that movement, because as you get certain movement, the way that you have two tracks that were interacted and some frequencies were colliding and some frequencies are being attenuated. Well, when you have movement, that's movement, the frequencies that were colliding now they are not colliding. Some frequencies that were being cut, now it's being boost, and all of that makes the overall final result feels much more natural, and that makes a completely different way.
Yeah, I think Scott nailed it right when he said, you know, when you have an audience or whatnot, when it's static, it almost turns into noise, right?
Yeah.
That micro movement, again, even for dialogue. So one of the plugins we make, Energy Panner, this one is a panner based on loudness. One of my favorite use cases for this in stereo or in spatial is something like this on dialogue or spoken voice. So what this would do is when she speaks soft, she's going to be slightly forward. When she sings or speaks louder, she's going to lean back into the room, right? Just like how a person would sing in real life, or even something subtle like this. When we speak, surely me, I don't sit and hold my head still when I'm talking. We all move our head very small bit. We don't move left and right. We don't bounce around, but we all move our heads when we talk. This setting simulates that. And to Scott's point again, even if it's not a stadium sound, it could be a dialogue, it could be some spoken voice. Having these micro movements suddenly brings sounds to life. In fact, Marco, what's your thoughts on movement and how it's perceived in spatial and in stereo?
Oh, movement is one of the best parts of spatial audio. I mean, thoughts about everybody on this is bang on. I mean, it's something that you really need to engage into immersiveness. Even when you're using binaural head tracking stuff, you need the head tracking because the micromovements of your head will make it sound more immersive. It will make it sound more natural. So I tend to use Energy Panner and Brightness Panner all the time. And one of the things that I love the most about it is the fact that I can be a curator. I just hit the dice and see what happens and see how it engages into what I'm doing at the moment. Thank you, Nuno, for that, because it's really cool to have that dice button there. And in fact, I mean, Scott and Emerald can have more thoughts about this because they're doing it all the time. But what I sometimes tell my students is that most of the time you're actually being curators. You're deciding on what you have, like 5, 10, 50 cuts of the same sound effect for the same, and you're trying to decide what's best as a photographer would do when he's trying to see what picture suits the best. And it's cool to have something that does movement and that we can do curation on it. So
Thank you, Marco. Yeah, since we touched on spatial, I want to go back to Scott and Emre and ask, I'll start with Scott. How did you get into spatial formats, including Atmos or even binaural, right? People don't realize you can actually work in spatial using your headphones with good binaural technology. When did you get into spatial, or when did you start thinking about sound design in spatial, and how did the newer tools shape your journey, Scott?
Sure. For me, the moment I got into anything out of stereo, I mean, I haven't done anything. I mean, I occasionally have to do stereo mixes and I hate it. But I'm so used to multi-channel just because it gives me the ability to just have more space. And I got into it originally. I'm trying to remember the gentleman's name. There was a 3D headphone-based a technology. I remember they were trying to sell it to Michael Jackson. No. Anyway, I'm forgetting which one it is, but it's the one where you put the headphones on and you hear someone cutting your hair and you hear a newspaper over it. And it was all using basically binaural head. But it was really neat because it made you feel there, like you were there.
Mhm.
What's great about film, specifically film compared to the TV, you're in a dark room, you've got this giant screen, and you can now move the room and control the room to make you feel immersive as if you're in the scene. Where music to me was hearing music 20 feet behind the screen, which was always challenging. So you hear the giant orchestra. I came out, it seemed like the orchestra went in as well as out, but and just really making the audience feel like you're there because you're in a dark room and there's this giant screen. And I think the first time I really went, my first early films was Honey Shrunk the Kids and Born on the 4th of July. I did a lot of Oliver Stone films.
Nice.
What I wanted to do was make, God, I wish I had the tools now that I that I didn't have then. But just trying to make it like we took people to a park and we had them running as if they were soldiers. And then we put them in different parts of the room. And at that point, we had 70 millimeter. So we had 7 speakers across the front, not 3. So now all of a sudden when they're shooting and the whiz-bys are going, oh my God, we wanted to make it feel like you were in the hooch with weapons. People are shooting at you. It's chaos, especially the way Oliver shoots, because the camera's always moving. They're always not in the right spot. Something explodes, the camera goes to them, and now the film starts, the audio starts becoming an integral part of why the camera's moving. Because you're an explosion and you're looking at where that came from, and there's another explosion here, and the camera goes back over there. So now there's strategic reasons why we edited that way. And it would have been so much fun, between that and the Doors, because so we had crowds.
Uh-huh.
They can never end because you would always hear cut and there was no tail. So we had to start up with the crowds when they shot it, no tails. Everything had to be manufactured from stagnant pieces. It would have been wonderful to have the technology to move around. We did it with faders and delays to kind of give it a little bit of a movement to it. But that's old school. That's,
That was before sound particles. Sound particles makes history.
it was,
right?
yeah, I mean, there's ways to do it. I mean, yeah, we pan pots, I had more things. Yeah, here, you grab these faders, I'll grab these faders, and we'll wiggle them.
Right.
And that was in the editorial process, not in the mix.
Wow.
Yeah, so we did all that prepping it with many, many 24 tracks. And to try to give you a feeling of naturalness. The moment you hear what we do, we fail. And interestingly enough, if you hear what we're doing and it sounds like a gimmick, I think I just took you out of the story. Now you heard it. Now I distracted you. I failed. It's got to be, you got to buy the illusion.
100% of that. Specifically, I think that's actually a good, thank you, Scott. But that's also a good segue to Emre, because when you're mixing to screen, one thing I also learned the hard way is if someone looks back and goes, oh, that string section was great, I failed at my mix because I'm not supposed to peel the eyes away from the story, from the screen. So, Emre, I have the same question for you. At what point did you realize or embrace spatial audio for music? When did you get into that world? And how do tools that we make or other companies make shape your journey in the spatial side?
I was quite lucky because I called up Genelec because I had to do an LCR mix for something and I didn't have companion speakers. I said, can I just get a center speaker? And the guy was like, you ever thought about Atmos? And I was like, absolutely not. No. I wasn't into 5.1. I'm quite into accessibility on formats. So I was taken down to Dolby and I had a listen and I had the headphone fold down and I was like, oh, actually, hang on, you can make this identical to the stereo mix if you do it right. And that means everyone could, balance wise and tone wise. So, okay, everyone could enjoy Atmos and then you have a portable format. So I was completely hooked. And that was in, I think, March 2021. So the renderer was just about available, but the Apple announcement hadn't come yet, so music wasn't being, there was zero demand for Atmos in music, absolutely zero. But I was lucky enough to find out that this was coming, so I really thought this is exciting, and so I paused the stereo things I was doing and just got into it then. So it was probably the first independent studio to do it in the UK, which is a lovely start. And I did my first mix, which was unbelievably terrible. And I remember sitting excruciatingly playing it back in Dolby, going, "Oh my God, what have I done?" But then after that, I reapproached and a couple more in, and it sort of worked for me. So that was then. And then I think we talked not a huge amount of time after that, and I found Energy Panel and Brightness Panel. I think that's when I got in touch. I was like, hang on a minute, this is what I need, because I need motion, and I need motion that isn't distracting and isn't is natural and sometimes invisible, and that does that very, very well. Especially if I sometimes sort of slightly bypass some of the reactive functionality and feed it like a 1K tone, so you get this constant
side chain it.
Yeah, so I'll just feed it a tone.
Nice.
And then I can dial into that tone and have a constant movement, which is really interesting, because then the way I can position that and place things and the way it reacts is so musical, even though maybe that wasn't the original intention. It's just this non-distracting sense of movement, which is engaging and lets elements in the mix just pulse and move, but in absolutely indiscernible ways. Unless you focus on it or you soloed it, you'd immediately hear the movement, but you'd never notice, particularly in the mix. And that I use this technique a lot in music mixing for Atmos, because I don't want, I do like static mixes. I don't like gimmicky mixes generally. Music, because it hasn't, the production's never been designed for that. I mean, Eno stuff is different. We went absolutely crazy with the panners and density and air, and we had an absolute riot, but that's a rare, occurrence. It's more if I'm doing pop mixes and doing stereo to Atmos versions. I use these a lot for, I don't know what else to use actually.
That's good to hear.
I kind of haven't looked, and I will upmix into them. So I'll use an upmixer on a stereo channel into the 7.1.4 version of Energy Panel, and then do mixes between the upmixed and the moving versions, and it's all coherent. It's so good, and folds down amazingly, which is what I look for more than anything else, because I'm unfortunately living in a headphone world with music. It's like when I'm mixing out, most of my headphones are on my head, and it's the absolute defining workflow is because of headphones, unfortunately, with music. So it's not my ideal, but my binaural version is absolutely critical, though I have to also maintain a coherent master mix, which is the speaker output that's the ADM is my master, and I don't want to compromise that for headphones. So all the workflow, and I can't tell you how helpful Sound Particles has been to that, because it's come from a deep understanding of spatial audio, which isn't really present in music so much. And that's crossed over into music tools. That people have to sort of embrace this, because there's not much that has come with that background into music and be useful music tools. It's
absolutely.
I can ask you a question.
Yes, go for it.
I was gonna say, what headphones do you use?
Well, I use a kind of like mid-level pair of audio and Austrian audio headphones, which are just relatively, they're good. They sound good. They're unhyped. They're pretty full range, and they're open backed. And I was using Audazes, and they sound great. And it was a really, really great pair of headphones, but it was almost too much information in some ways. I was using DT770s for a while, which are like £70, and I found this has been an interesting translation. So I have an HRT app I've made, which I play in the renderer. So I'm using these, and I found the best translation just come from this kind of like, I'm not thinking about the headphones I'm using too much. I'm just reacting. And then as I go around other places, I'm finding great translation with this kind of something full range. I'm not too hung up on it, because I'm not doing any mixing decisions on that, because I am not changing any tonality on a headphone. All I'm doing is basing positional data, metadata in my master mix, which I'm very, very particular about. Exactly, to slightly digress, before I start doing almost all my mixes for major labels and stuff, which is bringing the finished approved stereo master into immersive, I will match my stems so they null with the stereo master. So mastering's across my object-based mix, which is 100% object-based. I will null that, so it's as close to silence unless it's been through some time-based process. Like if it's been mastered on tape or something, I'll never be able to match it. But I'll get as absolutely close as possible to get non-modulating elements to disappear and be just left with limited distortion and modulating elements. And that's when I'll start my Atmos mix with a full mastering process across all the objects. So I'm sitting there first, then I'll start my Atmos mix. That's sort of making the speaker mix completely critical and absolutely match tonally to the producer and artist's vision. And so when I'm on headphones, it's not about any tonal decisions I'm making so much as to what's changing, and I'm referencing the stereo constantly and going, this has to be the same but spatialized, which is tricky, but that's sort of that's how I sell these. And this is, I think, why I do a lot of work for labels, because they can send it to me and know they're going to get the original mix back, but spatial.
But spatialized, right?
Yeah. So
absolutely.
So they can send it to the artist, and the artist goes, it's my mix. Because often these are on headphone approvals for Atmos, which is really sad, but that's
reality, right?
It's reality. So, and often people will hear this first. So, and I found when I've done this technique and done as coherent as possible, these are fully immersive. It's not just a little tickle of reverb in the sides. It's like, it's all the way around to get that experience of feeling like you're inside the music in an abstract kind of way, which works. It's not like a band thing, unless it is that, but that's kind of rare. Big pop music and drum and bass and UK pop and American pop and things. I want it to be a kind of an experience and slightly abstracted, but more emotional because you're inside the production, and that's fun. What I found is these translate to Apple Spatial quite well with some rules, because that's a different format, which I don't know how much that affects anything in post and cinema. I don't know. Do you brush up against Apple Spatial on things?
Not much on the post that I'm sure, right?
It changes the metadata. It doesn't work. It doesn't observe the metadata I set for my objects, which is getting more deeper into spatial audio, but it's just a full spatialization of what I've done, and that I have no control over. So
right, and there's more formats coming up, right? So
yeah,
Apple Spatial, that's a good segue. And you mentioned this earlier, Emre, that you want to be format agnostic, and that's something we believe in firmly. If you look at the output formats of pretty much any plugin we make, we support usually a little over 30 formats, from binaural to 714 to 916 to 6th order ambisonics, even more in sound particles standalone. And this is huge for students and educators, right? So Marco can attest to this, Chris at SAE can attest to this. No institution will ever have a lab for each student, right? You would share, let's say, 1 hour, 2 hours in a lab. A student could be working on this specific session I played, right? It could be maybe they're visiting LA and they go to Sony's custom room, and they can actually have that mapped in sound particles, and it will come out of each speaker in that specific room. When they come back to their dorm and they're working from their bedroom, all they have to do is turn on binaural, and suddenly they can keep working in the same format using headphones. This is huge, right? We are trying to lower the entry point for students and teachers to get into sound design and spatial. So you can keep working in any format and change it on the fly. I can say, I want this session to be in NHK or IMAX or Dolby Atmos. You can just select a preset, hit OK, and you just translate your sound design to that format, including custom formats. Maybe you are doing installation at ESMAE in Portugal, and you can say, I have 98 speakers and 25 subs. You type it in, enter the custom azimuth and elevation, hit OK. My mic is going to look funky, but hey, it's going to translate just the way you envision. So students and educators watching this is huge, that sound particles can adapt to any format. And it gets better. So this is the tools that people like Scott and Emre uses. And Sound Particles 2, as a matter of fact, is 100% free for students and educators and schools. It's the exact same software that's powered many Hollywood projects. So we're literally giving this to you for free. You have no excuse to go out and record and do sound design, right? Nuno has been a professor in the past, and he believes in education. We believe in education. That's why we do this. and everything else we make, you actually get 50% discount. And we even have one specific bundle meant for educators and students. That's a discount, right? So once again, you don't have an excuse not to do Hollywood grade sound design or mixing just the way Scott and Emre does. We are almost approaching the top of the hour. Scott should be, and I should be in bed as well. It's almost 1 a.m. in LA, people. But before we wrap, I wanted to ask Scott, do you have any advice for students and upcoming artists who want to break into the industry, whether it be as a sound designer or as an engineer? What specific skills, like, do you think spatial is overrated, or do you think that's an essential skill if you were to hire someone? Where do you stand on that?
Okay, I've got a couple philosophies in how to start. I'm a musician as well, but I think of what I do as actually part of music, because music is organized noise and I add to the noise. So what's important, I think, is you learn the technicalities of your instrument. I'm a guitar player, a guitarist, and you learn how to play. You learn the technical things of where your fingers got to go and how you're going to pick, et cetera, et cetera. Now you've got to figure out what you want to play. So you have to have what I call my inner ear. I need to understand what it's going to sound like before I ever start. There is experimentation along the way, but I think it's important. How do students do that? Listen, listen, listen. Whether if you want to go into movies, listen to movies. If you want to go into games or VR, you got to listen to it. And you've got to start getting a vocabulary. In my field, what is an explosion? What is a gun? What is a realistic gun? And what is a really cool Hollywood gun? I mean, a lot of times they have two different thoughts. Same thing with crowds. Same thing, interestingly enough, with sirens. I've been learning, because I do shows that aren't only American, but I've got to understand, how do people speak from other countries? What are the sirens like in other countries? What is so many different things? What is the pace? What's the feel? Are there high frequency, low frequencies? Is more Asians? Are they speaking more nasally? Are they, all the different things, whether it's Walla groups, many things we have to do. Vehicles, how do vehicles sound in Asia? What's the echoes like between the buildings in London and New York compared to Arizona?
Right.
Where you've got big open land. So you start getting a vocabulary, and it's almost becoming an audio photographer. You listen, listen, listen. Then when you get the tools, then you go, oh, this sounds like I needed to create New York in LA. I needed that sound, and I couldn't get anyone in New York to do what I needed to do quick enough. So I realized that LAX, there's two buildings and they have buses. So it goes, so I'm getting the slap between the two buildings and the parking structure. So I'm putting PZMs at the time, because, having mics up kind of freaks everybody out. And you start recording to try to get that sound, because I remember growing up in New York, that's that sound. Or what does London sound like? I did the Nightcrawler, and I had to figure out, what does LA sound like? So now all of a sudden you have to start listening. Then you go to the tools and say, well, the microphones I had were okay. Let's say I decided to do an XY recording, but it really should have been an ORTF. So now I got to take that sound and make it wider. I could take dual mono and put them in different speakers, and that gives you a big opening. Or I could use particle effects and spread it out. There's many things, but you got to be able to hear it and understand and have a big vocabulary. And it's a lifetime pursuit. Animals are huge as well.
Wow, that's an amazing advice. I wish I got that 20, 30 years ago. So thank you for that.
Because then you can learn tools. I mean, when I learned, I was on an Atari computer. Then it was Waveframes, and it was sound tools, then it became Pro Tools, and then there was SSL and AMS and all these workstations. And now you got Pro Tools, but you got Reaper. If you're going into gaming, you have to know Reaper. It's one of the
Right.
big things you have to learn. So now the tools keep changing, but what you're going to play, whether it's an acoustic guitar, a bass guitar, electric guitar, the kind of electric guitars, it's the same thing. The resultant is the same. So that's my long diatribe.
No, thank you so much, Scott. That was really, really inspiring. So thank you for sharing that. Emre, what would you suggest for someone who's trying to get into, as a student who's trying to get into spatial music production, mixing? What's your advice on how best they can break in?
Definitely challenging, because you do need to really sit in front of speakers and be in that privileged environment to get an idea of what's going on. So I would seek out initially that opportunity if you can. If you have it at your university or college, definitely don't sleep on that. You don't have to do it exclusively, but you need that experience. So when you get into a binaural engine, and the sound particles one, I really say it's a very good experience binaurally. You can understand what you're hearing and why, and that's the biggest challenge, I think, of getting into spatial. The tools, and especially with like these education offers and the ability to get so much processing and creative sort of arsenal very easily now, which is, as Scott said, I mean, I started on an Atari. This is my sort of 18-year-old self looking now, and my mind is blown completely. It's like I can't imagine being able to do anything like this on the plane, which is, I'm going to go on tour this month, and I'm taking work to do with me, and but I can do everything with a binaural engine. I can make some mix decisions if I have to, and probably do some tweaks. I'd say just get in front of speakers if you can, as your primary thing in a well set up room, and hear what happens when you move things around, and hear how that correlates to the binaural. And that's the best underlying sort of building blocks of understanding some spatial process. And then the most important thing, which I think Scott said too, is listen to the content, listen to what people have made in music, and listen to what you like. And it's tricky in with music in spatial, because it's new and it's the Wild West, and it's really, there's not this long established tradition of sort of quality spatial mixing. It's really could be anything, but that's the best thing to do, is to start out hearing maybe some flagship mixes, or hearing some stuff you like, and working out how that sounds on headphones and on the speakers, and spending a bit of time listening. All your time listening would be the best use, because you can read about the technique and stuff later and then work it out. Technique is just there to achieve what you're trying to do. And if you don't know what you're trying to do, there's no point in having the technique. You need to try and have some kind of vision from something that's inspired you, and some music that you love that has worked spatially to be more emotional than it would be before. Then that's the quest. But that's something, it's a personal journey, right? To find stuff that inspires you to do that. I think that's maybe the
Awesome.
random rambling advice early
No,
morning
it's
London.
again, it all goes back to why we do what we do, right? We all do, we are in the business because we love what we do. It's all about emotions, it's about storytelling. And that's why we also want to encourage the upcoming generation, the younger generation, to do what we do, right? Marco, what's your thoughts? What's your advice on students getting
Oh,
into
I mean,
industry?
I'm really grateful that Emerald and Scott just said what they said, because it goes to actually what I teach. The first assignment that I give my students when they're into 3D audio is, listen, guys, you're going to spend this entire month just listening to tracks, because if you don't understand what's being done, you won't be able to engage. I can teach you all the tweaks and panners and all the things, but at the end, if you don't know the language of this, it doesn't really matter. So you really have to spend time listening to what artists have been doing in 3D audio, with sound designers have been doing in 3D audio. It's so I'm really grateful that Scott and Emerald went that way, because it goes tight with what I try to do with my students here. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. Well, we heard it from the masters. Nuno, so Emery already mentioned, one of the first things everyone has to do is experience spatial in speakers, which can be done, a few times perhaps, right? Maybe in a lab, like you spoke about. And Emery also mentioned, I remember this clearly, the first time I gave a demo to Emery, his first thing was like, man, this sounds awesome on Zoom. What are you doing? And I was like, that's a binaural built into sound particles. And at the time, Nuno was actually not even happy with that binaural. He was like, no, no, this can be even more better. So Nuno, my question to you is, can you talk about what you're doing next to lower that barrier for people to get into more into spatial without having to have all the speakers? Of course, they need to have that experience. But one, what's your vision? And two, do you have any advice for students?
Yeah, so of course I have this huge passion for spatial audio that comes from many years ago, and I want everyone to be able to enjoy the spatial sound because it's great in movies, in music, in TV, in all sorts of things, in video games, and let's be practical. We know that most people will not be able to get 10 or 12 speakers in their living rooms. Most people will use headphones. So we need to have a solution that works well with headphones, but give you this sense of spatial audio. But life isn't fair in the same time, in the same way that we have rich people and poor people. In binaural, you have people where binaural works and people that binaural doesn't work. And eventually you may be one of the lucky ones that you have an average kind of ear, which means that the generic HRT apps and binaural works with you, and some other guys like myself included, when most binaurals doesn't work at all. So over the last 5 years, we have been creating and doing research in our own personalized binaural technology that we're going to release in a few months to improve that and make sure that more people, not just the lucky ones that are actually able to get a good binaural sound because their ears are pretty much standard or very average like. So we have been working a lot in that regard because it's a very, very, very complex problem. My advice for students, it's pretty much, we are not reinventing the wheel. It's the same thing like Scott mentioned, like learning a new instrument. Okay, if you are learning a new instrument, doesn't matter if it's a guitar, a trumpet, or violin, or whatever. What you do, well, you need to know how to handle the technicalities of things. Yes, also you're going to listen to great players that are able to show you, oh, this is the kind of things that you can do with the instrument. And then what you do, you practice and practice and practice. So pretty much it's the same advice here. Yes, you need to learn the practicalities of things. You need to learn how to use this and that. And the same way that if you're working with music, you need to learn how to use an equalizer, a compressor, those sorts of things. Okay, now you're going to have to learn a few more tools in the meanwhile. Yes, you should also listen to great spatial mix out there for you to, the same way that you would listen to fantastic musicians to know exactly where can you go. And then you need to practice and practice and practice, because once again, it's like a musical instrument. It's not because you read 10 books on how to play a trumpet that now you are able to play a trumpet. You need to go there and try and miss and fail. But all of that brings knowledge and allows you to become a better musician. In this case, practice, and like Emre was saying, okay, my first Atmos mix was not very good, but the second is better and third is better, and we are improving, and now he's what it is, and well known for his work in this area. So pretty much that's my advice to everyone.
Inner ears to Scott's work. Go ahead, Scott.
You know, I also want to say one thing. Your freshman, sophomore year, part of your junior year, is learning the tools, learning what they do. By the way, we're still doing that. Like, even through this, I've been like, what? You got a new piece? And I mean, these guys are the toy makers. We're like, you got a new paintbrush? Cool. What does it do? And then you go, I don't need it. And then 2 years down the line, you go, oh, I need it. So constantly trying. So because when I was a student, you're overwhelming. Freshman, sophomore, part of junior is just learning what things are, what they do, how they work it. But it's really fun to do in the junior, senior year when you start getting a feel for, hey, I know what these things are. I've got a somewhat decent idea of what they do. And this is really important. Try to break it. Try to use it in a way. I mean, the problem that we as professionals face is we're on the clock. We need to do what we need to do really fast. Our arms go there. We know what we're doing. In our free times, like I have a room that I just experiment and do nothing but that. But it's hard to find the time. When you're a college student, you're 24/7. You don't have any responsibilities. Nobody's asking you to do something quickly. Now, all of a sudden, whether it's microphones, whether it's plugins, putting things together in ways that may not even make any sense. But look what you come out of it. So you've got to make a lot of mistakes. And then occasionally, and I learned so much from the young people I hire, they'll be like, oh, I use this. I go, I've never heard of that. And it may not even be a good piece of technology, but it has this really funkiness to it that I'm like, oh, I love that. You know, whether it's a guitar pedal or some kind of technology. And I think what's great, even with sound particles, it's deep. It's not like 3 buttons and you're there. I mean, you can spend a lot of time playing, experimenting. So think outside the box in the last year. Think how you can use things in some very weird ways. And it may sound horrible, horrible, horrible. And then all of a sudden it goes, ding. Ooh, that's kind of cool. And I just got finished doing Transformers 1. I had to redesign the concept of the Transformer sound. And I said, I know how to do that. And then I started doing it and I didn't know how to do that. And everything sounded horrible. And I said, it's going to be a vocoder. And I went, I know it's a vocoder. It's not a vocoder. And I started thinking about, God, in that era, what technology did they have? And then I sort of went, screw it. And a lot of it's now guitars, pedals, and weird ring modulations, and just, you know, and it took me 4 weeks of panic. You know, the first week I was cocky. The second week I was nervous. And the third and fourth week is like, I got to get this done. And it wasn't happening. And then all of a sudden, ta-da, they loved it. They thought it was brilliant. I thought it was going to fail several times over. And then it's amazing how it just sort of comes together.
Right. You spend 4 weeks trying to figure it out, and then 4 minutes you have the final thing you want.
Oh, of course. And they were like, it's overnight. Yeah, sure, no problem.
Yeah. I remember a classic example when I was a student. I was, of course, being a student, I have all the time. I'm trying to get a telephone EQ right. I think I spent 4 hours trying to get that right telephone EQ. Nothing works. My boss comes and he goes, oh, that's easy. I'm like, how? He said, pick up a phone, play through the phone, record on the other end of the other phone. Boom. Right. Took 2 minutes, literally. All I had to do was play through a phone and record a phone. I have a telephone EQ. So sometimes, yeah, you spend 4 hours, then you finish the project in 40 seconds. But that's a brilliant, brilliant, wise advice, Scott. Do things, make mistakes when you can afford to do that, right? And that's when you're in school. Look at making mistakes and you will find a few gold nuggets. And that's just brilliant advice, man.
Sometimes I will get a new bit of gear, and this isn't necessarily brilliant advice, but I do this quite often, and I will turn it to maximum just to hear what the extreme version of what it does. And then sometimes can be quite educational in that you go, oh, it's actually doing all the saturation and it's changing the tone. When you really use it in extreme ways, then back it off and work out where I want to use it. But it gives me some idea of the character of what it is, not in everything, but sometimes it's interesting to just break it. See, exactly as Scott said, it's like, how does this, when I'm using this on stun, is it, I mean, it might not be usable, but I get all the character that I would struggle to pick out if I'm not so experienced at first. And it could be a quick fix of kind of go, oh, hang on, this does that. And then work it out from there and then try and hear what it's doing at usable levels, or maybe leave it.
Yeah, but hey, pushing and experimenting. Another example, happy accent that I still follow is I do lots of music work myself. Once I had accidentally patched in one of my Manly mastering compressors into my vocal chain. It sounded great. And since then, 14 years and counting, I still use that mastering compressor as part of my vocal chain. Right. So just because something is a mastering gear or a guitar pedal doesn't mean it's only meant for guitars, which we know, right? But to Scott's and Emre's point, apply anything to anything. mix and match and see what particle magic you get inside sound particles and beyond. But man, time flies. It's 1 a.m. and past 1 a.m. already in LA.
Almost breakfast.
There you go. That's the spirit. Let's do an ADR session, Scott. But seriously, this has been amazing. We had lots of attendees. We still have a way over 60 people staying with us. Thank you so much for joining us for this amazing webinar. Scott, Emre, Marco, and Chris and Nuno, huge thank you for making this happen, especially considering the hours. It's been either late in the night for me and Scott and early in the morning for everyone else. So thank you so very much. It's been very educational, very informative, and very inspiring. So until next time, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. See you guys.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.
Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye.